I sold every last share I owned in the elite social club because I was ready to settle down and focus on my wedding. My two business partners, the women who had once sworn I was the only man they would ever love, were still completely oblivious. At that very moment, they were preoccupied with throwing a lavish celebration for their new male assistant. I was the one who spent weeks at the stables with a client, even sustaining a serious injury during a training session to secure a massive investment deal. That assistant just stood there and watched as I collapsed in agony, unable to even stand before being loaded into an ambulance. Instead of helping, he rushed back to the club to present the news as his own achievement and soak up the praise. To my disgust, my partners actually gave him all the credit for my hard work. By the next morning, a doctored photo of me, supposedly sharing a passionate kiss with a client while on horseback, began circulating through the company iMessage groups. The entire staff began to laugh and mock me behind my back. Rumors spread that the only way I secured high net worth clients was by sleeping with them. I was stuck in a hospital bed with an 4 drip in my arm, trying to call my partners to explain the truth, but they wouldn't listen. They simply sneered that I must have strained my back because I was being too aggressive during my romantic tryst on the horse. They told me to stop making up pathetic stories about falling off a horse to cover my tracks. They said if I was too embarrassed to show my face, I should just stay hidden at home instead of trying to win sympathy. Oscar had done a fantastic job in their eyes, and they told me not to come back and ruin the mood of his party. The day I left the hospital, I walked straight into the club and sold my entire stake to our biggest frenemy in the industry. Afterward, I called my parents and told them I was finally ready to go through with the arranged marriage to Ava Miller. I told them they could officially start the wedding preparations. When Sarah and Chloe walked past me and overheard the word marriage, they both stopped and knit their brows in confusion. They asked what I was talking about and why I was being so secretive. I told them there were only 10 days left until the big day, so there was no point in keeping a secret any longer. I informed them that I would be handing out their invitations shortly, but they just laughed it off as a pathetic joke. As we were speaking, my phone began vibrating incessantly with dozens of messages from my mother. She was sending over final wedding themes and various styles for the formal invitations. They leaned in to peek at my screen, and when they saw I was marrying a woman who was reportedly paralyzed, they burst into uncontrollable laughter. Sarah sneered at me, asking if the Miller family had paid me a fortune to move down to Atlanta and serve as their personal servant. Chloe clutched her stomach, doubled over with laughter, and remarked that she had heard Ava Miller was completely paralyzed from the waist down. She mockingly asked if I really believe a woman in a wheelchair could ever provide me with a fulfilling life. It was devastating to hear such vile insults from the two women who had once promised to spend their entire lives by my side. Oscar happened to walk in at that moment and caught the tail end of our conversation, looking at me with a shocked expression. He addressed me as Director James and asked if I hadn't already promised to be Mary Harrison's boyfriend. He had the nerve to suggest that juggling multiple relationships was quite inappropriate for someone in my position. Thanks to his loud mouth, a rumor was already flying around the club that I was sleeping with our most important client. I shot him a frigid glare and told him that he should learn to keep his mouth shut when his superiors were speaking. I told him I would overlook his lack of manners for now, but I warned him that stealing my professional credit and fabricating scandals was a legal matter I wouldn't ignore. My sharp rebuke left his face flushed with embarrassment, and he stuttered out a weak apology. He claimed he didn't realize it was a secret since I hadn't explicitly told him to keep quiet after Mary and I left the stables. He then slapped his forehead as if he had just had a grand epiphany. He suggested that Mary must have put the massive contract in his name as hush money to keep his mouth shut about our supposed affair. I raised my hand to slap the smug look off his face, but Sarah and Chloe both grabbed my arms at once. They told me that if I didn't want people talking about my dirty laundry, I shouldn't have aired it in the first place. Sarah snapped at me, demanding to know why I was taking my frustrations out on Oscar when he hadn't said anything false. She added that regardless of who I intended to marry, toyed with people's emotions was a truly pathetic way to behave. I was so livid that I actually started laughing, realizing that words were useless at this point, so I simply turned and walked back to my office. After 5 years of building this business from the ground up and sacrificing everything for them, it was heartbreaking that they chose to trust a man they had known for 2 months over me. I decided to stop wasting my energy on such petty people and went back to reviewing the wedding arrangements my mother had sent. Not 2 minutes later, Sarah sent a blast to the entire company iMessage group, demanding that I hand over my keys and give my car to Oscar. Her reasoning was that Oscar deserved a reward for landing the biggest contract in the club's history, so he should have access to our best company vehicle. The group chat, filled with hundreds of employees, immediately erupted with people brown-nosing the new favorite and offering their hollow congratulations. I wasn't entirely without allies, however, as a few employees immediately spoke up to question the decision. They pointed out that Oscar was just a fresh graduate who had been with us for less than 8 weeks, and giving him the general manager's car seemed incredibly excessive. Just as I was about to message those supporters and tell them not to risk their jobs for me, Oscar posted a voice note to the group. He used his most pathetic, wounded tone to address Chloe, claiming that everything was entirely his fault. He whined that he had been so focused on the business deal that he had failed to protect my privacy, making him unworthy of the car or even my presence. He even went as far as to offer his resignation in front of the whole staff. Hearing that manipulative, fake voice of his made me want to throw up. Chloe burst into my office a moment later, screaming at me for being a bully. She ordered me to clear my personal belongings out of the car immediately and hand the keys to Oscar. She accused me of trying to ruin a young man's career just because I was bitter. Sarah followed, right on her heels, demanding I go to the parking lot while simultaneously typing out comforting messages to Oscar in the group chat. Suddenly, the phone pinged with a frantic message from an employee claiming that Oscar was standing on the edge of the roof. Sarah and Chloe both turned pale with fear and went sprinting toward the stairs to save him. I watched their panicked retreat for a moment before turning back to my desk to finalize the sale of my shares. I calmly reached out to the buyer to confirm that I was ready to sign the papers. It seemed word had traveled fast because Sarah's biggest frenemy, Freya Vanderbilt, reached out with an offer that was far too generous to turn down. I checked the timestamp on the formal notice I had sent to my partners weeks ago. They had failed to exercise their right of first refusal within the 30-day window, and that deadline had expired yesterday. Since they had ignored my legal notice, they no longer had any say in who I sold my portion of the business to. Freya offered me 3 days to think it over, but I didn't need a single second. I replied immediately, telling her I was ready to sign the transfer agreement right then and there. Once the deal was finalized, the 2 women finally reappeared in the parking lot after their dramatic rescue of Oscar from the roof. When they saw that I was still in the middle of gathering my things from the car, they immediately began snapping at me. They asked me if I was moving house or just grabbing a few items, mocking me for taking so long. Oscar stood nearby, biting his lip and looking at me with tearful eyes as he whispered a pathetic apology. He sniffled and said he didn't even want the luxury car and that I could keep the vehicle and the general manager position if it would make me happy. I looked him dead in the eye and asked him how he could offer to give me a position that already belonged to me. That single sentence left Oscar completely speechless and fumbling for words. The arrogance he had displayed when stealing my hard-earned contracts had vanished instantly. Sarah stepped forward with a frigid expression, demanding to know what I meant by that remark. She asked me if I was really going to be this petty over a simple company vehicle. I didn't bother being polite anymore, informing her that my family's garage was filled with high-end cars and that I had no reason to fight over a mid-tier executive sedan. I told her the only thing I actually cared about was having my professional achievements stolen by a mediocre assistant. The sheer contempt on my face clearly infuriated Chloe, who snatched the keys off the desk and stormed toward the parking lot with a murderous look in her eyes. She proceeded to dump every single one of my personal belongings from the car straight into the trash. Sarah gave me a brief, dismissive glance before putting her arm around Oscar and leading him to the driver's side to show him how to use all the features. When the workday finally ended, Sarah walked in my office and told me not to leave because there was a staff dinner tonight. I was genuinely baffled when she explained it was a celebration for Oscar learning how to drive a car. I asked her if they were seriously throwing a party for something so mundane. I didn't refuse the invitation, though, as I figured it would serve as a good final meal with the staff before I left for good. However, once I arrived at the restaurant, I noticed that every single employee who had defended me in the group chat was missing. I soon learned that Sarah had fired all of them throughout the afternoon on trumped-up charges. I sent a few quick messages to my former coworkers and found out that Sarah and Chloe had issued a direct threat to the entire staff. They told everyone that anyone caught communicating with me or giving me information would be blacklisted from the Chicago social club industry forever. It was shocking that they were willing to fire loyal, long-term employees just to protect Oscar's fragile ego. They were clearly making an example out of them so that no one would dare to cross the partners again. One of the remaining brown-nosers took the opportunity to lean over and whisper something snide in my ear. He reminded me that I had missed Oscar's last celebration and suggested that I owed the boy a toast tonight. He smugly added that if Oscar hadn't secured Mary's contract, I probably would have had to sell my body to even more clients to make the same amount of money. That nasty comment brought back all the vile rumors I had overheard in the club's restrooms lately. People were saying I had a thick skin and that my supposed business talent was nothing more than a willingness to use my body to close deals. They whispered that I was a flirt with no dignity left to speak of. While everyone watched me expectantly, I took the smallest possible sip of my wine to be polite. Sarah's face darkened instantly, and she reached out and slapped the glass right out of my hand. Chloe acted as if she had been waiting for the cue and immediately filled a fresh glass to the brim with red wine. She told me that after the way I had embarrassed Oscar earlier, the least I could do was offer a proper alcoholic apology. She reminded me that I still owed him a drink from the party I had missed while I was in the hospital. Without a second thought, I threw the entire glass of wine directly in her face and asked her who the hell Oscar thought he was to deserve a toast from me. The entire table went silent with shock, but even Sarah didn't yell. She just calmly refilled the glass and shoved it back toward me with a cold, hard stare. Sarah told me that I was going to drink this glass for the sake of company unity, whether I liked it or not. Oscar put on a show of being the bigger person, telling Chloe that he knew I looked down on him and that they shouldn't force me if I didn't want to drink. He begged them not to make it difficult for me because it made him feel awkward being the center of the conflict. But Chloe, with wine still dripping from her chin, wasn't about to let the insult slide. She lunged forward in a fit of rage and slapped me across the face. Before I could even react, she grabbed my jaw and forced the wine down my throat. She screamed at me, asking what right a man who sold his body for contract had to look down on someone like Oscar. Both of them knew perfectly well that I had a severe alcohol allergy, but they didn't care as long as they were defending Oscar's honor. As the liquid hit the back of my throat, my head began to spin almost instantly. My chest tightened and my breathing became labored while cold sweat began to pour down my face. They completely ignored my obvious physical distress, focusing instead on pouring Oscar another glass of his favorite vintage. Oscar downed his drink in a single gulp and flashed me a triumphant, beaming smile. He thanked me for handing over such a precious thing to him and promised that he would work even harder to make them proud. The rest of the table thought he was talking about the company car, but I could see the predatory look in his eyes. He was clearly planning to seduce both Sarah and Chloe to secure his future. I choked out a response, wishing him luck in marrying his bosses and having a very successful career. I tried to push myself up from the table to go to the restroom and get the alcohol out of my system, but Sarah blocked my path. She demanded that I apologize to Oscar for my snarky comment. My skin was starting to itch uncontrollably and my chest felt like it was on fire while my face turned a deep, angry crimson. I looked up at Sarah, struggling to draw breath as I asked her why she was forcing me to drink when she knew about my allergy. She hesitated for a split second before scoffing that my father and grandfather were legendary drinkers, so there was no way I could actually be allergic. Chloe joined in, asking how a grown man could be so weak that a single sip of wine would ruin him. She added that even if I had a slight sensitivity, it certainly wasn't going to kill me. It was clear that neither of them had any concept of how dangerous an anaphylactic reaction could be. They didn't take my condition seriously at all, but I remembered every detail of the last time I had a reaction. I had accidentally eaten a dish cooked with beer while out with a client and felt my throat closing up after only a few bites. Back then, they had been terrified and rushed me to the emergency room, begging the doctors to save me. Sarah had cried by my bedside, blaming herself for not checking the menu more carefully and promising she would never let me suffer like that again. They both stayed by my side until my color returned, their eyes red from weeping. They spent the whole night making me soup and refused to sleep because they were so worried I might stop breathing in the middle of the night. The following morning, they both went into work with dark circles under their eyes and worked double shifts just to cover the meetings I had missed. We had survived the most brutal years of starting this company together and shared every struggle. These were the same women who once claimed they would never marry anyone else because they only wanted me. Yet here they were, hurting me without a second thought just to impress Oscar. I managed to wheeze out a request to be taken to the hospital, my throat so constricted that I could barely speak. I was stumbling and unable to keep my balance as I tried to move. One of my coworkers realized I was in trouble and tried to help me up, but Sarah roughly shoved her aside. Sarah told the girl to get away from me, asking if she used that same pathetic look to trick clients into buying memberships. The poor woman turned pale and tried to explain to Chloe that she wasn't flirting, but that I was clearly having a medical emergency and couldn't breathe. Chloe just scoffed and said I was faking it because I was too embarrassed to face the group. It wasn't entirely surprising she didn't recognize the signs because during my last reaction, I had tried my hardest to downplay my symptoms so I wouldn't worry them. I had only toughed it out back then because I didn't want them to feel guilty about the mistake, and since we got to the doctor so fast, the reaction stayed relatively mild. Because of that, they had convinced themselves that my allergy was just a minor annoyance rather than a life-threatening condition. Oscar had been watching the entire scene with a smug grin on his face when he suddenly picked up a glass of what looked like water. He moved toward me, patronizingly telling me that regardless of how I got my clients, I was still a valued member of the team. He said they would always remember my contributions to the company, a comment that sounded polite but was clearly meant to imply I was a prostitute. Sarah, who had been half-heartedly holding my arm, suddenly jerked away as if she had touched something filthy. She told me that if I was going to act this way, I should just leave before running to the bathroom to scrub her hands. I stumbled out of the room under the judgmental glares of the staff, my only goal being to reach my car and find my EpiPen and antihistamines. I had almost reached the exit when I remembered that the car didn't belong to me anymore and that Chloe had thrown all my medicine in the trash. I realized my only option was to try and make it to the hospital on my own. Oscar stepped in front of me to block my path, grabbing my arm to keep me from leaving. The liquid in his glass splashed onto my bare skin, and I realized with horror that it wasn't water at all. It was high-proof vodka. My inflamed skin felt like it was being pierced by 1,000 hot needles the moment the alcohol touched it. I instinctively shoved him away, causing the rest of the drink to soak both of our shirts. Oscar immediately began wailing, claiming that he had accidentally grabbed the wrong glass. Chloe rushed to his side and frantically ordered someone to run to the pharmacy for allergy medicine for him. She didn't even notice that I was the one drenched in the alcohol. Oscar's skin remained perfectly clear while mine was already starting to blister. I looked like I'd been doused in boiling water, my entire body turning the color of a cooked lobster. Sarah returned from the bathroom and saw Oscar clutching his throat and wheezing theatrically, and she finally snapped. She swung her arm and delivered another stinging slap to my face, calling me a vicious monster. She screamed that Oscar was only trying to help me and demanded to know why I was so determined to ruin the life of a young man who was just starting out. At that moment, every ounce of pain and betrayal I had felt over the last few weeks boiled over. I forced myself to hold back my tears and managed to let out a dry, hollow laugh that sounded more like a sob. I reminded her that Oscar had just posted photos of himself doing shots on Facebook a few days ago. I asked her how he had suddenly developed a life-threatening allergy the second he got a little vodka on his shirt. My laughter only served to enrage Sarah further. She grabbed my arm with bruising force and dragged me back over to Oscar, demanding that I apologize to him immediately. Chloe was busy fussing over Oscar's hands with a wet napkin while continuing to hurl insults at me. She shrieked that an apology was mandatory because Oscar was highly allergic and even a drop of alcohol could be fatal for him. A moment later, an employee arrived with a full box of high-strength antihistamines. I reached out a trembling, swollen hand to try and take one of the pills for myself. Chloe didn't even look at me as she reached out and violently slapped my hand away from the box. My hand was already inflamed and burning, and her strike left dark purple marks against the crimson skin. The combination of the stinging pain and the deep, unbearable itching made my entire body tremble with agony. Sarah continued to glare at me as if I were a common criminal, asking if I was going to keep causing a scene instead of apologizing. I realized then that if they couldn't even offer me a shred of human decency, I was a fool to expect them to share their medicine with me. A coworker standing nearby noticed that my skin was starting to blister and looked dangerously inflamed. She hesitated for a moment before quietly suggesting to Chloe that I might actually be having a real allergic reaction. After the colleague's quiet warning, Sarah knit her brows and finally took a good look at my beet red skin. For a fleeting second in the dim restaurant lighting, I thought I saw a flash of genuine concern or guilt in her eyes. It looked like she might actually care for a moment, but that feeling vanished the second she saw Oscar theatrically scratching at his perfectly normal-looking arms. She hardened her expression and turned her back on me once again. She told me that even if I was having a reaction, I deserved it for being so difficult. She ordered me to apologize and then get out of her sight. I knew I would never apologize for something I didn't do, but I was also reaching my limit and didn't want to collapse in front of everyone. When Oscar realized I wasn't going to budge, he put on another performance of being the saint. He told Chloe that he would be fine and suggested they take me to the hospital instead, acting as if he was suffering in silence. Before he could finish his sentence, he let out a dramatic shriek of pain that sent Sarah and Chloe into a blind panic. They both fumbled for their phones to call 911 for him. I didn't have the energy to watch his theater anymore, so I turned around and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. A light rain was falling outside, and the cool mist against my burning skin provided a small amount of relief from the heat. I heard footsteps behind me and hoped for a second that Chloe had finally come to her senses, but she only caught up to me to throw a key fob at my feet. She told me to take my junk and stop being so careless, claiming she was tired of cleaning up after me. I looked down at the wet key fob for a moment before picking it up and tossing it straight into a nearby trash can. Chloe was so incensed that she nearly poked me in the eye as she screamed at me. That key fob had been a custom gift from her and Sarah years ago, and back then I had treated every little thing they gave me as a priceless treasure. They used to have playful arguments over which of them gave me the better presents. To keep things fair and avoid jealousy, they eventually started splitting the cost of everything so that I could never be accused of playing favorites. I told her that once something becomes filthy, it belongs in the trash. I added that she and Sarah were no different, and since they were rotten to the core, I was throwing them away too. I saw a flicker of genuine pain in her eyes, as if she finally realized what she had lost, but she didn't say a word. Before she could process my words, Oscar called out to her, and she went running back to him. I managed to hail a cab in the rain and get to the emergency room, where I went through hours of treatment to stabilize my system. It was nearly 3 in the morning before I finally felt like I was going to survive. When I woke up the next morning, my phone was vibrating with hundreds of messages from numbers I didn't recognize. My message was flooded with disgusting harassment, ranging from lewd comments to people asking for my hourly rate for sexual services. Someone sent me a link to a website, and when I opened it, my heart sank to see my personal bio and contact info on a shady escort site. The main photo used was an intimate shot that Sarah and Chloe had taken of me years ago during a private moment. I called them immediately to confront them about the leak, but they denied everything and had the audacity to blame me for it. They told me I needed to be more careful with my private life because my scandals were hurting the club's brand, and they ordered me to take an indefinite leave of absence. Since I had already sold my shares, I had no intention of ever stepping foot in that place again. I simply said fine and hung up, leaving them in a stunned silence on the other end of the line. They clearly expected me to beg for my job or throw a tantrum, so my calm acceptance caught them off guard. My voice sounded lighter than it had in years, as if a massive weight had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Sarah started to say something else, but Oscar called out for her in the background, and she hung up without another word. I knew they were behind the leak, and I fully intended to let the police handle their illegal behavior. They clearly thought I was a pushover who would just take their defamation and privacy violations in silence. After handing all the digital evidence over to my legal team and the local precinct, I packed my bags and caught the first flight to Atlanta to start my new life. I tried to sleep on the flight, but my mind was racing with memories of my grandfather. Before he passed, he had arranged a marriage for me with the Miller family to secure our legacy. Having grown up with a love for simple living, I had rebelled against the idea of a corporate marriage or running the Harrison family empire. I had stubbornly left home to build something of my own with Sarah and Chloe, refusing to listen to my parents' warnings. They eventually gave up on trying to bring me home and allowed me to spend 5 years trying to prove myself in the business world. I had dreamed of returning home as a self-made success, but instead, I was returning defeated and broken. When I stepped off the plane in Atlanta, I found my parents waiting for me at the gate with worried smiles. Seeing how much they had aged and the new silver in my father's hair made my heart ache with regret for my selfishness. I realized that if I had just stayed and helped with the family business, they wouldn't have spent the last 5 years worrying about me. My mother pulled me into a tight embrace, her eyes welling with tears as she remarked on how much weight I had lost. She told me I had looked unwell during my last visit, but now I looked truly exhausted and frail. She reminded me that, as the Harrison heir, I should have been home enjoying my life instead of killing myself to build a company for 2 ungrateful women. She was heartbroken that I had suffered so much just to line the pockets of people who didn't care about me. After she finished lecturing me, she asked what Sarah and Chloe had said when I told them I was getting married. I simply shook my head and looked away, not wanting to recount the ugly details of our final meeting. I told her that they were never more than business partners and that I had cut all ties with them after selling my shares. My parents weren't stupid, though, and they knew perfectly well that my feelings for those women were the reason I had avoided the Miller marriage for so long. I had been torn between Sarah and Chloe for years, unable to choose between 2 women I had grown up with and built a life with. Back then, they were my world, and I felt that choosing one would mean betraying the other and destroying our business partnership. I was terrified that a romantic choice would lead to a professional divorce and leave one of them heartbroken. I spent years suppressing my own desires just to keep the peace and ensure that our trio remained intact. I had this naive dream that we would grow old together as partners and travel the world once we were wealthy enough to retire. I never could have imagined that the business I gave my soul to would be torn apart the moment a manipulative assistant entered the picture. It hurt more than I could put into words to see 5 years of loyalty and affection discarded so easily for a stranger. However, I had to accept that their characters were flawed and that the only dignified thing left to do was walk away. My mother looked at me suspiciously and asked if we had fought, noting that my sudden agreement to marry Ava Miller seemed suspicious. She was terrified that I was only rushing into this marriage because I was angry and seeking revenge. My father was more laid back, telling me that my happiness was all that mattered and that he wouldn't have forced the marriage if I really didn't want it. I tried to sound as cheerful as possible to convince them that I was making this choice with a clear head. I told them that I had finished my little adventure and was ready to focus on the family legacy and building a home. I apologized for being so difficult in the past and pointed out that merging the Harrison and Miller empires was a brilliant strategic move for everyone involved. My years in business had taught me how to make cold, calculated decisions in every area of my life except for my relationships with those two women. When it came to love, I was a total amateur who had been played for a fool. My parents seemed relieved by my explanation and finally dropped the subject. We shared a quiet family lunch, but as the afternoon wore on, the nagging pain in my lower back began to flare up again. They noticed me whine and sing and immediately insisted on taking me to the doctor, but I tried to brush it off. My father warned me that ignoring small injuries was a recipe for permanent damage and told me to stop being so stubborn about my health. Just as I was about to argue, I looked up and saw Ava Miller standing in the doorway looking perfectly healthy. I was stunned because I had been told for years that she was confined to a wheelchair and unable to walk. There she was, standing tall on two perfectly functional legs with no sign of any physical impairment whatsoever. She immediately noticed my discomfort and, with a look of deep concern, insisted on driving me to the hospital herself. I couldn't say no to her, so I climbed into the car and let her take over. I wanted to ask her about the miracle recovery of her legs, but the stabbing pains in my back were so intense that I couldn't focus on anything but the memories of my former partners. For 5 years, I had dealt with this recurring back injury alone. In the early days of our business, Sarah and Chloe would panic and rush me to the doctor. But as we got more successful, they stopped caring about my well-being entirely. I try not to complain because I didn't want to be a burden and knew they were busy with their own lives. However, from the moment Oscar arrived until the day I had my spinal surgery, they hadn't bothered to visit me in the hospital even once. While I was recovering from surgery, they were busy taking Oscar to trendy restaurants and posting photos of their happy family on Facebook. The isolation of that hospital room was made even worse by the fact that they were allowing a newcomer to steal my work and trash my professional reputation. The emotional pain eventually became so intense that I went numb to the physical pain in my back. In a strange way, I was almost grateful to Oscar because his betrayal had finally freed me from the impossible choice between Sarah and Chloe. Ava noticed my distant expression and reached out to gently rub my back, promising me that we were almost at the hospital. I was thankful my parents hadn't come along because I didn't want to have to explain the true extent of my injuries in front of them. It would have been humiliating to admit to them that I had sacrificed my health for two women who ended up stabbing me in the back. As Ava reviewed my medical history and surgery notes, her expression became incredibly cold and focused. I felt a strange sense of guilt as she read the reports, and I told her that if my injury was a deal breaker, I would understand if she wanted to call off the wedding. The doctors had already warned me that I would have to be extremely careful with physical activity for the rest of my life. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes and told me it was her fault for pressuring me into the marriage in the first place. She reminded me that I had never once judged her for her supposed disability, so she would never judge me for mine. I was so anxious that I couldn't stop fidgeting, fully expecting her to walk away from me. I was floored when she apologized to me instead. Before I could ask her about her legs, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Sarah. Sarah was screaming into the phone, accusing me of sabotaging Oscar's deal with Mary. She demanded to know why Mary was demanding a full refund and canceling her contract, even accusing me of trying to seduce the client again. I quickly stepped into a quiet corner and covered the phone, terrified that Ava would overhear the nonsense. Sarah took my silence as a confession and began berating me for ruining my own career and acting like a madman. I told her they were the ones who had lost their minds and that they should go talk to their golden boy Oscar if they wanted answers. Chloe jumped onto the call as well, screaming that I couldn't just walk away from a business we had built together. She told me I had to do whatever it took to win Mary back because losing her account would be a financial disaster for the club. It was clear they only cared about their bottom line and didn't give a damn about me. Chloe made it crystal clear that I was nothing more than a scapegoat for their failures. I used to enjoy the challenge of winning over difficult clients because I thought I was doing it for my partners, but now I felt nothing but disgust. Looking back, I realized I'd done all the heavy lifting while they sat in their climate-controlled offices. I had spoiled them for 5 years, and I was done. I told them in a cold, clear voice that the club was no longer my problem, and hung up. They didn't take me seriously, thinking I was just throwing a tantrum to get attention. Sarah actually tried to bribe me by promising to buy me a new Ferrari if I saved the deal. I laughed out loud at the absurdity of them thinking I was motivated by a car. I blocked their numbers and erased them from my life for good. However, I didn't want Freya Vanderbilt to get screwed over by their incompetence, so I gave her a courtesy call to warn her about the situation. To my surprise, Freya just laughed and told me not to worry about it. She said it would be good for Sarah and Chloe to suffer for a while, so they could finally appreciate what they had lost. She even invited me to partner with her on a new venture in Chicago with a 50-50 split. I turned down the offer, but made sure to give her the contact info for all the talented staff Sarah had fired. When I walked back into the exam room, I found Ava Miller taking meticulous notes while the doctor explained my post-operative care. Seeing her so focused on my health filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. On our drive home, I asked her to keep the details of my injury secret from my parents so they wouldn't worry. She looked me in the eye and gave me her word that she would personally see to my recovery. Looking into her sincere, beautiful eyes made my heart skip a beat, and I felt a genuine connection for the first time. It was a feeling of pure affection that I had never experienced with Sarah or Chloe in all those years. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and managed to whisper a quiet agreement. Ava became a permanent fixture at my house, coming over every single day to guide me through my physical therapy. My entire family was surprised by her dedication to my recovery. At first, my parents would eavesdrop on our sessions, hoping to hear us flirting. When they realized she was truly focused on my health, their respect and love for her grew even deeper. Thanks to her constant support, my mobility improved much faster than the specialists had predicted. One evening, my mother pulled me into the kitchen to talk about Ava. I was shocked to learn that all the wedding designs my mother had shown me were actually created by Ava Miller. It explained why I had struggled to choose between them, since every single option was exactly what I had always imagined for my dream wedding. My mother explained that after Ava's accident years ago, she had never once asked about her marriage contract. My parents felt a deep sense of guilt and had been trying to gauge my feelings before forcing the issue. Apparently, Ava had told them that she wouldn't marry me if she remained paralyzed because she didn't want to be a burden on my life. My mother wiped a tear from her eye and told me that having a woman of such character in our family would be the greatest blessing of my life. It finally clicked that Ava's silence all those years wasn't due to a lack of interest, but out of a selfless love for me. I also realized that my parents had kept her recovery a secret because they wanted me to choose her for the right reasons. I knew that if I had known about her condition, I would have married her out of pity rather than love. My parents had carried the weight of the Miller family contract alone just to give me the chance to find my own path. The overwhelming love from my parents and Ava's selfless devotion brought me to the verge of tears. From that day on, we dove headfirst into wedding planning, spending every waking moment on dress fittings, photo shoots, and final logistics. Ava was constantly on the lookout for any signs of pain in my back, and she would immediately stop everything to give me a massage or a heat pack. I was embarrassed by the attention at first, but her genuine care was so touching that I eventually just let her take care of me. When I noticed her hands getting tired, I would gently take them in mine and force her to take a break. Her hands were small and delicate, and I loved the way she blushed whenever I held them, the color creeping up her neck and over her ears. We spent our evenings walking hand in hand through the gardens, enjoying the peaceful silence of each other's company. Word of the Harrison and Miller wedding soon leaked out, and it became the biggest news story in all of Atlanta. Although the paparazzi followed us everywhere, our families kept a tight lid on the media, and the public only heard stories about how much in love we were. The news was driving our stock prices to record highs until someone dug up the fake profile on that escort website and shared it online. A malicious smear campaign began, claiming that I was a high-end gigolo with a penchant for older women. They even went as far as to call me a professional gold digger who specialized in taking advantage of lonely, wealthy socialites. The scandal exploded on Twitter and TikTok, and speculators began betting that the Miller family would call off the wedding. Both the Harrison and Miller stock prices took a nosedive as the rumors grew more and more outrageous. I realized I couldn't keep my past a secret anymore if I wanted to save our reputations. I wasn't ashamed of my work in Chicago, but I was terrified that Ava would believe the lies and think less of me. I gathered all the evidence of my legal battles in Chicago and went to see Ava, ready to explain everything. Before I could even open my mouth, she pulled me into a fierce hug and told me that she had never doubted me for a single second. I was stunned by her unconditional support, realizing that real love didn't require a stack of legal documents to prove innocence. We went to the Atlanta police together, and with the Harrison family's influence, they tracked down the source of the leak in record time. The rumors died down as soon as the police issued a statement, and our stock prices stabilized. I wasn't about to let the perpetrator get away with it, though. With the combined resources of our two families, we quickly discovered that Oscar was the one who had uploaded the photos. I wasn't surprised in the slightest that he was the culprit. When my lawyers served him with the lawsuit, Sarah and Chloe finally discovered that I was the heir to the Harrison fortune. They were on the next flight to Atlanta to beg for an audience with me. They had the audacity to claim that Oscar had just made a mistake and that I should be the bigger person because I was wealthy. They tried to play the inexperienced youth card, claiming he didn't know any better. I cut Chloe off mid-sentence and reminded her that Oscar was a 22-year-old man, not child. I told her I could almost forgive him for being an overeager social climber who stole my work credit. However, I was not a saint, and I was certainly not going to ignore the fact that he had systematically tried to destroy my reputation and life. They both looked shocked, refusing to believe that their precious assistant was capable of such malice. I threw the forensic digital evidence on the table, and they both went white as sheets. They had never suspected that Oscar would be devious enough to doctor the photos of me and Mary Harrison to make it look like we were intimate. He had edited the images to make it look like we were sharing a horse and a kiss, when in reality we were yards apart. He had even found a photo of me in pain from my back injury and used it to imply something completely different. When viewed out of context, the photos were definitely damning. He knew that the high-end stables we used had a strict privacy policy and wouldn't release security footage, so he assumed I would never be able to prove my innocence. He used those photos to convince everyone in our social circle that Mary and I were having an affair, and because the images were so well edited, no one questioned him. He was smart enough to only share them in internal groups to avoid legal detection while still ruining my name. He would post the photos while pretending to be concerned, telling everyone to keep it a secret so Mary's reputation wouldn't be destroyed. Unfortunately for him, Mary Harrison found out exactly what he was doing and how he had stolen my credit for the deal. She was so furious that she pulled every single one of her accounts from the club and convinced her entire social circle to do the same. Chloe was shaking with rage and confusion, unable to understand why Oscar would betray me when she had been so kind to him. I just shrugged and told her that her poor judgment was her own problem to deal with. Sarah sat there in silence, finally realizing that there was no way she could defend Oscar after what he had done. She began looking at me with that old familiar affection, but it only made me feel sick to my stomach. I turned to walk away, but they both grabbed my arms, pleading with me to stay. They begged me not to marry Ava and claimed they had just been misled by Oscar's lies. Chloe had the nerve to suggest that I hadn't really been hurt and asked me to just forgive and forget. I ripped my arm away and told them that their lack of empathy was exactly why I was leaving. I reminded them that I had literally broken my back and needed surgery just to bring in the Mary Harrison account for them. They had stood by and let Oscar destroy my reputation, and then they had nearly killed me by forcing me to drink alcohol despite my allergy. I asked them if they truly believed that a hospital stay and permanent spinal damage didn't count as real harm. Sarah asked with a straight face if I had really been to the hospital twice, still trying to downplay the severity of my allergy. I looked at them as if they were the most ignorant people on earth before showing them a video of Oscar doing shots at a bar. I asked them if this looked like the life-threatening allergy that Oscar had claimed to have. They finally realized they had been played like fiddles and that I had been telling the truth the entire time. Sarah actually slapped herself across the face and apologized, begging me to remember the years we spent building the club. She asked me if I could really walk away from everything we had achieved together. Chloe chimed in, reminding me of our old dream of traveling the world once we were rich. She asked how we were supposed to do that if I was tied down in a marriage with another woman. I pulled up the digital contract with Freya Vanderbilt and showed them that the deal was already done. I told them the club was their problem now and that they could spend as much time with Oscar as they wanted while I focused on my new wife. They stared at the screen with a mixture of pure rage and total disbelief. Sarah screamed at me, asking how I could betray them by selling my stake to their biggest rival in the city. Chloe shouted that even if I wanted out, I should have offered my shares to them first. I had predicted they would say this, so I pulled up the original legal notice I had emailed to both of them weeks ago. I told them to look at the date and reminded them that I had sent the notice the very day they hired Oscar over my objections. I had waited for the full legal 30-day period, and they hadn't bothered to respond to a single message. Under the terms of our operating agreement, their silence was a legal waiver of their rights. I told them Freya's offer was far better than anything they could provide and that I was done being their unpaid servant. They scrambled to check their laptops, but claimed they never received the email. I told them to check their trash folders, and when they found the deleted messages, their faces drained of color. They immediately blamed Oscar, claiming he must have deleted the emails from their accounts to keep them in the dark. I just looked at them with pity, knowing that even if they had objected, they didn't have the capital to buy me out anyway. There was no law that required me to be their slave just because we started a company together. I told them to stop wasting my time and to go back to Chicago to figure out how to grovel to Mary Harrison before their business went bankrupt. Sarah was on the verge of a breakdown, whispering that Mary had blacklisted them among the entire Chicago elite. My refusal to help had them both panicked and desperate. They begged me not to let the business I built collapse out of spite. Remembering my conversation with Freya, I felt a small twinge of pity for the mess they had made of their lives. I suggested they talk to Freya since she was now a major shareholder and likely the only one with enough influence to save them. Chloe began to sob, realizing that I truly didn't care about the company anymore and that I was willing to let their enemy take control. She begged me not to abandon them, claiming that I was only marrying Ava to spite them for their treatment of Oscar. She told me that marriage was too serious a thing to use as a weapon in a business dispute. She argued that a merger between the Harrisons and Millers was just a cold business deal with no love involved. She cruelly reminded me that everyone knew Ava Miller was a cripple and told me I was ruining my life. Sarah nodded along, asking what a woman in a wheelchair could possibly offer me besides a bank account. She suggested that being married to Ava would be no different than living a life of celibacy and loneliness. They both promised that they could give me both wealth and the love I craved if I would just come back to Chicago and return to the way things were. I couldn't stop myself from laughing at their delusional offer. My parents had always told me I was a terrible judge of character, and I finally realized they were right. I had spent years treating these two mediocre, selfish women like they were precious treasures. I told them that even if Ava were paralyzed, they wouldn't be worthy to brush her hair. I told them to stop using the word love to describe their manipulative behavior because they didn't have the slightest clue what it meant. It made me sick to think that they had expected me to sacrifice my dignity and flirt with clients just to bail them out of the mess they created. They were willing to use my very soul as a bargaining chip to save their business. Even if they truly believed the rumors that I was just a pretty face who slept around, they had no right to ask me to continue that behavior for their benefit. Any lingering affection I had for them vanished in that instant. They actually tried to argue that they never forced me to work, claiming that I'd done it all of my own free will. It was as if they were saying I deserved the abuse because I was stupid enough to give them my loyalty. I felt like a fool for ever believing in them, as if I were the one slapping my own face for my stupidity. Sarah saw the look of utter disgust on my face and suddenly turned and slapped Chloe across the room. Sarah screamed to her to shut up, accusing her of making things worse by being so insensitive when my life was in shambles. Chloe, already on edge, didn't hesitate to strike back at Sarah. She demanded to know why Sarah was blaming her when the plan to use Oscar to motivate me was a joint decision. She mocked Sarah for acting like a saint when she was just as guilty of the betrayal. Chloe shouted that she had only wanted to accompany me on business trips to protect me, while Sarah had accused her of just wanting to sleep with me. They started arguing about their pathetic competition for my affection. She pointed out that they had both ended up with nothing because they were too lazy to do the actual work. She challenged Sarah to use her supposed talent to go out and secure her own client for once. Sarah's eyes were practically glowing with rage as she lunged at Chloe, and the two of them began brawling right in front of me. She screamed at Chloe, asking who was the one who had been drooling over Oscar since the day he walked in. She asked if she was the only one who had claimed Oscar was a poor boy who needed a chance. She reminded Chloe that she was the one who had insisted on hiring him because she was obsessed with his physique. Sarah accused Chloe of using Oscar to try and make me jealous, and she refused to take the fall for a plan they had hatched together. They were so busy tearing each other apart that they didn't notice Ava Miller arriving. As they rolled around on the floor, screaming at each other, Ava rushed to my side and grabbed my hand. She looked me over with frantic concern, asking if I was all right or if those women had touched me. Once she saw that I was unharmed, she turned her gaze towards Sarah and Chloe, her eyes becoming cold and sharp. The two of them stopped their fighting and stared in shock at our joined hands. They were stunned to see that Ava was a beautiful, elegant woman who could clearly walk perfectly well. Sarah stammered out a question, asking me who this woman was. Ava didn't miss a beat, informing them that she was the cripple they had been mocking. The two of them shared a look of pure hatred and lunged toward us, trying to physically tear me away from her. They hadn't realized that Ava hadn't come alone, and my family security team intercepted them before they could even get close. Ava, absolutely livid over their treatment of me, stepped forward and delivered a resounding slap to Sarah's face. She warned them that if they ever showed their faces in Atlanta again, she would handle them personally. We walked out of the hotel hand in hand, leaving them behind as we prepared for our wedding the following morning. I thought they would have the sense to leave, but they showed up at the wedding venue looking like they hadn't slept in days. They began making a scene, screaming that they loved me and that Ava would never be able to give me a real family like they could. Their pathetic display didn't stop Ava and me from saying our vows and sharing our first kiss as husband and wife. Security quickly escorted them from the premises, leaving them to watch the rest of the ceremony on the giant public screens outside, sobbing in the street. A few days later, I saw photos of them crying on Twitter, but I felt absolutely nothing for them. If I was able to walk away from the business I built with my own blood and sweat, I could certainly walk away from two people who had proven to be toxic. Once my parents and Ava heard the full story of their betrayal, they used our family's influence to ensure Oscar was prosecuted to the full extent of the law. They then systematically began dismantling Sarah and Chloe's business interests. They eventually orchestrated a hostile takeover of the Chicago club, returning it to my control. My father insisted that my 5 years of labor should belong to me and not to two women who had treated me with such contempt. I was officially the owner of the club again, but Ava and I were so busy running our family empires in Atlanta that I didn't have time to manage it. I decided to leave the day-to-day operations to Freya Vanderbilt, who had proven herself to be a loyal ally. I gave Freya a massive stake in the company and let her run the show since her assistance had been vital in catching Oscar. Our families continued to prosper, and my life with Ava became everything I had ever hoped for. My marriage to Ava only grew stronger with each passing day as we built our future together. Our businesses were more successful than ever, and I finally felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. When everything James gives to Ava is taken for granted, walking away becomes his final act of dignity. He refuses to throw away the rest of his life just because he is afraid to lose the time he already invested in her. Real love should be about Ava cherishing his scars rather than her just trying to exploit his worth for her own gain. From this moment forward, James hopes he will never be anyone's stepping stone again. He deserves to finally be seen as a priceless treasure in the eyes of someone who actually cares.